Dust jumped under Daniel Mercer's boots as a bucket of cold water crashed across his face. He jerked awake in the dirt, ribs screaming where someone had worked him over. A woman knelt beside him, breath shaking from the effort of dragging his body off the road. Her travel dress was torn, valise lying open in the dust. Daniel's gaze caught the letter half sticking from it. Mail order bride registry, rejected. Hoofbeats rolled across the distant ridge. The woman looked down at him. Because the rejected bride who saved his life might be the only one who could heal his heart. Before we ride deeper into the story, hit subscribe, ring the bell, so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. Daniel Mercer stayed upright only because the woman kept one hand under his arm. The riders on the ridge moved again, not fast, not careless, just enough to show they were following the road. Daniel felt the warning crawl through his bones. Horse still sound, he asked. Clara Whitlock glanced toward the animal tied beside the ditch. The bay gelding lowered its head and flicked an ear. He'll carry two if he has to. Daniel nodded once, then we move. He pushed away from her and staggered toward the horse. The world swayed with every step. Blood had stiffened the side of his shirt. His ribs ground together like broken boards under weight. Clara caught his arm again. You're not riding alone. I wasn't planning to. She stepped closer so he could lean on her without saying so. The prairie wind picked up. It carried the dry smell of sage and dust. Somewhere behind them, a hawk screamed across the sky. Daniel grabbed the saddle horn and pulled himself up with a grunt that scraped out of his throat like broken gravel. Clara swung up behind him. Her grip tightened around his coat. Which way? Daniel lifted his chin toward the west. My ranch. The gelding started slow but steady. They left the road and cut across open grass. The riders on the ridge turned their horses. That was enough. Daniel leaned forward and urged the gelding faster. Every stride punched pain into his ribs. Clara's voice stayed quiet behind him. Those men, they did this to you. Daniel spat blood into the wind. Asked the wrong questions. What questions? Land. Clara fell silent. They rode another mile before the ranch appeared on the horizon. A low house, weathered boards, a barn leaning slightly against years of prairie wind, split rails stretching across the pasture, no smoke from the chimney, no other riders. Daniel slid from the saddle before the horse stopped moving. The ground caught him hard. Clara jumped down and helped him to his feet again. You should lie down. I'll lie down when I know they're not following. He walked toward the barn. Each step left a faint red mark in the dust. Clara noticed but said nothing. Inside the barn, the air smelled of hay and old leather. A single lantern hung from a nail beside the door. Daniel lit it. Warm light pushed back the shadows. Clara helped him sit on an overturned crate. You've been beaten before, she said quietly. Daniel looked up. Her eyes had settled on the pale scar around his finger, the mark where a wedding ring once lived. Everyone out here has, he said. That isn't what I meant. Daniel looked away. Clara opened her valise and pulled out a small cloth bundle, bandages, a tin of salve. You travel prepared. My father believed in preparation. Doctor. She nodded. Clara knelt beside him and carefully cut away the torn cloth around his ribs. The bruising had already spread deep and dark. She worked slowly. Her hands were steady even when his breath tightened with pain. 3 ribs, she murmured, maybe 4. Daniel gave a faint, humorless laugh. You sound disappointed. I've seen worse. She cleaned the wound and wrapped the bandage firm but careful. The lantern flickered. Outside, the wind shifted. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel watched her hands work. Precise, practical, not afraid. "You said they turned you away," he said at last. Clara tied the knot in the bandage. "Yes." "Why?" She sat back on her heels. The man who ordered the bride changed his mind. "Is that all?" Her jaw tightened slightly. He said he was expecting someone younger. Daniel studied her face in the lantern light. Dust on her cheek, bruise near her jawline, travel weariness in her eyes. "You rode all the way out here for him?" "Yes. And then they told me to leave before sunset." Daniel leaned back against the rough wall. "That registry back east promises men a lot of things." Clara gave a small shrug. "I wasn't promised anything." Outside the barn, a loose board knocked softly against the wind. Daniel listened. No hoofbeats, not yet. Clara followed his gaze. "You think they'll come here?" "They might." "Why?" Daniel did not answer. Instead, he reached slowly into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. The edges were creased from use. Clara glanced at it. "Land records." "Copies? For what?" Daniel held the paper a moment before handing it to her. Clara unfolded it under the lantern, her brow furrowed as she read. "These signatures, they don't match." Daniel watched her carefully. "No. And the debts listed here never existed." Clara looked up slowly. "Someone's stealing land." Daniel nodded. "Name at the top of that page." Clara read it again, her voice lowered. "Rourke Langford." The name seemed to settle in the barn like a cold draft. Even the lantern flame twitched. "I heard that name in town," she said. "Everyone has. He owns half the valley. Trying to own the other half." Clara folded the paper again. "And you asked questions?" Daniel nodded, and his men answered them. They sat in silence for a moment. The wind rattled the barn doors again. Clara looked toward the open pasture. "I shouldn't stay." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You just patched me together. That doesn't mean I belong here." Daniel pushed himself upright with effort. The motion made him wince. "You saved my life. You would have done the same." Daniel didn't answer. Clara stepped toward the door. "If those men are following you, they'll follow here." Daniel's voice stopped her. "They already know where I live." She turned. "Then I'm making things worse." Daniel looked around the barn. Empty stalls, tools hanging untouched, dust gathered where work should have been done. "You might be making things better." Clara blinked once. Daniel continued slowly. "I can't ride for a few days." "That's obvious." "You can." Clara crossed her arms. "I'm not staying out of pity." "Good," Daniel said, "because this place doesn't need pity." He nodded toward the barn door. "It needs work." Clara looked at the pasture again. The wind moved through the tall grass like waves across water. "You're offering me a job." "Temporary." "For how long?" Daniel shrugged slightly. "Until I can ride again." Clara studied him, and then, "You go wherever you want." She considered that, then she nodded once. "All right." The next morning came cold. Clara woke before sunrise. The ranch house was quiet. Daniel slept in the chair beside the hearth, boots still on, hat tipped low across his brow. Clara stepped outside. Frost covered the grass. The world was silent except for the slow shifting of cattle beyond the far fence. She pumped water from the well and filled a bucket. The sound carried through the still morning. Inside the house, Daniel's eyes opened. He watched through the window as she moved across the yard. Not hesitant, not uncertain, just working. By the time the sun rose, she had already fed the horse and swept the porch. Daniel stepped outside. You always work this early. Clara wiped her hands on a cloth. My father said sunrise tells you how the day will behave. And what does this sunrise say? She looked at the pale sky, cold, quiet. Daniel nodded. Fits the valley. He leaned against the fence and watched her for a moment. You ever worked a ranch? No. Then you're learning fast. Clara gave a faint smile. I'm good at learning things when I have to. Daniel noticed the tired lines around her eyes. How long were you on the road? 3 weeks. Alone. Yes. He nodded slowly. Most folks wouldn't last 3 days. Clara looked toward the hills. I didn't have many choices. Daniel followed her gaze. A faint dust line moved far along the eastern ridge, too distant to see riders clearly, but the shape of it told him enough. Clara saw it too, visitors. Daniel's voice stayed calm. Maybe. Clara watched the distant ridge, then she turned back toward the barn. Well, she said quietly, if they are coming. Daniel looked at her. This place is going to need both of us ready. Daniel watched the dust line on the eastern ridge until it thinned and disappeared into the pale morning glare. Could have been riders, could have been wind. Out on that much open land, trouble often looked like weather until it was close enough to hurt a man. He turned toward the house. Clara was already moving toward the barn with the water bucket in one hand and her valise in the other. Not fleeing, not asking, just setting herself to the day as if the decision had already been made. Daniel followed at a slower pace. Inside the barn, she set the valise atop an empty grain chest and looked around at the tack, the tools, the stacked feed, the sweep of dust lying in the corners. You truly mean for me to stay. Daniel rested one forearm against the stall rail. I mean for you to earn your keep while my ribs mend. That wasn't what I asked. He held her gaze for a moment. Morning light came through the gaps in the boards and laid thin gold lines across the hay. Clara stood in the middle of them, travel-worn and tired, yet somehow upright in a way the place had not felt in a long while. You can stay until I'm riding proper, he said. After that, you choose your road. She nodded once, then I'll not be a burden. Daniel almost said that burdens usually announce themselves louder. Instead, he looked toward the saddle rack. You know cooking. Yes. Mending. Yes. How are you with stubborn horses? A flicker passed through her face. Not fear, memory. I've known stubborn men. I suspect the lesson carries over. The corner of Daniel's mouth moved before he could stop it. Clara saw it and turned back to the gelding before he had to answer. The morning wore on under a pale sun. Daniel showed her where the feed was kept, which fence line needed watching, which milk pail leaked at the seam, which stove draft stuck when the wind came from the north. He spoke little. She asked only what she needed. The quiet between them was not comfortable yet, but it was no longer sharp. By noon, the yard looked less forsaken. The porch had been swept. The pump handle no longer squealed because Clara had found the oil tin and worked it into the hinge. 2 shirts Daniel had meant to wash 3 weeks earlier hung clean on the line, snapping in the wind like surrender flags he had never meant to raise. He stood on the porch with one hand braced against the post and watched her cross from the chicken coop to the house, carrying eggs in the apron fold of her dress. "You work like somebody's counting the minutes," he said. She stopped at the foot of the steps. When a person has been turned out once, she learns not to waste the place she's given. Daniel looked away toward the pasture. It was a simple sentence. It landed heavier than it ought to have. Inside the house, Clara moved as though she had no wish to trespass and every wish to set things right. She cleared ash from the stove, aired blankets, opened the window above the sink to let out the stale smell of shut rooms. Daniel had grown used to that smell, a mix of smoke, leather, old coffee, and loneliness. By late afternoon, it had been pushed aside by bread dough rising near the hearth and a pot of beans simmering low. He sat at the table, pretending to sort receipts while watching her hands knead flour at the counter. "You always this busy?" he asked. "No." "Then why today?" She dusted flour from her fingers. "Because idle thoughts make poor company." Daniel knew the truth of that well enough. A knock sounded at the front door, not hard, not hurried, but strange enough to freeze the room. Clara looked up at once. Daniel rose more slowly, his ribs protesting. He crossed to the wall peg, took down the shotgun, and opened the door with the barrel low but ready. No one stood there, only a folded scrap of paper tucked into the frame. Daniel's jaw hardened. He pulled it free and opened it. Clara watched the color leave his face by a shade she would not have noticed if she had not already learned how much the man hid. "What is it?" He handed her the note. It was short. Men who ask after papers often lose more than blood. No name, no signature, none needed. Clara lifted her eyes. "They know. They knew before yesterday. And now." Daniel took back the note and tossed it into the fire. "Now they want me thinking about it." She watched the flames eat the message. "Is it working?" He did not answer. That night the wind changed. It came hard from the north and hit the house in long, cold shoves. Clara set extra wood near the hearth. Daniel barred the door and checked the window latch twice, though he acted as if it were habit and not concern. They ate in the warm circle of firelight, beans, cornbread, coffee black enough to stain regret. Clara sat in the chair across from him. Daniel noticed the table looked less empty with someone there. He hated noticing it. "Who is Rourke Langford?" she asked at last. Daniel kept his eyes on his plate. "A man with more money than mercy. That describes half the men in this territory. Not with his reach." The fire cracked softly. Clara waited. Daniel set down his spoon. He lends to ranchers in dry years, buys notes from banks, leans on sheriffs and assessors. By the time a man sees the rope, it's already around his neck. "And the papers you found. Proof some of those debts were built crooked." Clara folded her hands in her lap. "Then why keep them here?" "Because there's nowhere else to keep them. You could take them to a judge." Daniel gave a low, humorless breath. "And which judge would hear me against Langford?" She had no answer for that. Outside, something struck the side of the barn. Both of them looked up. Daniel was on his feet first, pain forgotten for the moment. He took the lantern and stepped onto the porch with the shotgun in his other hand. Clara came behind him despite his silence. The yard lay silver under moonlight. The barn doors swayed slightly. Something rolled near the trough. A stone, nothing more. Daniel scanned the dark beyond the fence. No rider, no voice. Only the long whisper of grass under wind. Clara stood beside him in the cold. A warning. He nodded. Will they come back? Oh, yes. She drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders, but did not retreat. Daniel looked at her then, truly looked. A woman turned away by one man, stranded on a road, hunted by no one and yet unwanted everywhere. She should have been the sort to shrink from another person's trouble. Instead, she stood in the yard with him as if fear was merely another chore to be endured. You ought to take the spare room, he said. Clara blinked. I thought you meant for me to bed in the barn loft. I did. And now, the north wind cuts through the boards up there. A pause, that concern for my comfort, Mr. Mercer. Concern for not burying my help before winter. She almost smiled. Inside, she laid her things in the small room at the back of the house. Daniel heard the quiet movement of drawers opening, fabric folded, a pitcher set on the washstand. Small sounds, house sounds. They should not have unsettled him as much as they did. Long after the fire burned low, he still sat awake in his chair. The wedding band scar on his finger caught the last red light from the coals. Clara's voice came softly from the doorway behind him. You never go to bed before the fire dies, do you? Daniel did not turn. No. Why? He stared into the embers. Some nights, a man gets used to keeping watch. For what? He said nothing. Clara stepped farther into the room. She wore a plain nightdress and her shawl around her shoulders. Her hair had been unbound, and in the low light she looked younger and more tired at once. You were married, she said quietly. Daniel's hand closed into a fist. The scar whitened. Yes. She died. He nodded once. Clara waited, but she did not press. The silence between them stretched with the heat of old things. Finally, Daniel spoke. 5 years ago, spring storm, creek came up fast. His voice was flat, stripped of everything but fact. My wife was riding back from town with our boy. Clara did not move. I should have gone with them. The words hung there, harder than any he had spoken since she arrived. I stayed to finish a fence, he went on. Thought I had time, thought I could do one more thing before weather broke. His jaw tightened. By the time I reached the crossing, the wagon was already turned. The fire shifted. A log settled inward. Daniel looked at the coals as if he could still see muddy water in them. I got to my son first, too late for him, my wife. He stopped and swallowed once. I heard her calling, but I couldn't get through. Clara drew a breath so slight it almost made no sound. Daniel finally turned his head enough to see her. There was no pity in her face, only sorrow, quiet, clean. That is why you keep watch, she said. Daniel nodded. I keep watch, he said, because I once chose work over people who trusted me. The room held still around that confession. No wind at the window, no creak of timber. Even the house seemed to listen. Clara stepped closer and rested one hand on the back of the chair across from him. You were one man in a storm, she said. I was a husband who should have known better. And since then? He looked away. Since then, I learned land asks less of a man than love does. Clara was silent for a long moment. Then she said, that may be so, but land does not sit awake in the next room when danger comes. Daniel lifted his eyes. Their gazes met across the dim light. Something changed then, not large, not spoken, just a shift as real as the first warmth after snow. A board knocked loose somewhere on the porch. Both of them heard it. Daniel rose carefully and crossed to the window. Far off beyond the pasture near the eastern line, a small orange glow moved once and vanished. Lantern light, a rider or a watcher. Clara came to stand beside him. "They're out there," she whispered. Daniel kept his gaze on the dark. "Yes." He barred the window tighter. Behind him, the house no longer felt quite so empty. Ahead of him, the prairie no longer felt content to leave them alone. And in the silence that followed, Daniel Mercer understood a hard truth he had been trying not to name. Letting Clara Whitlock stay had not merely brought company into his house. It had brought the fight to his door. Daniel left the window barred long after the lantern glow vanished from the eastern line. Morning came hard and grey. The wind had dropped, but the quiet felt worse. Quiet after a warning always did. Clara was already at the stove when he stepped into the kitchen. Coffee steamed between them. Biscuits warmed on a cloth by the hearth. The room smelled of flour and wood smoke instead of old ash and shut dust. Daniel noticed it at once. He noticed her too, moving with care through a house that had begun, against his own better judgment, to answer back to human hands. "You sleep?" she asked. "Enough." She looked at him as if she knew better. Then she set a folded envelope beside his tin cup. It had been pushed under the front door sometime before dawn. Daniel opened it. Inside was a formal notice stamped with the county seal. Delinquent balance due on grazing acreage. Payment required within 10 days. He read it once, then again. "That debt was settled in March," he said. Clara wiped her hands on a towel. "Then someone wants it unsettled now." Daniel stared at the seal. "Official, clean, cold. They mean to squeeze you in daylight now," she said. He folded the paper carefully, but his jaw had already gone hard. By noon, they were headed for town in the wagon. Daniel drove. Clara sat beside him with the envelope and the earlier copies of the land papers wrapped in cloth on her lap. The road ran pale between stretches of dry grass, and every fence they passed seemed to lean a little more than it had last season. Men were losing ground all through the valley. Daniel had known it for months. Now he could feel the shape of the trap closing around his own acreage board by board. Town looked the same as always. False front buildings, hitching rails, dust moving low along the street, yet something had shifted. Conversations paused when Daniel pulled up before the mercantile, not openly, not long, but enough. Clara felt it too. "Your name travels ahead of you," she said quietly. "Langford's money travels faster." Inside the store, the keeper avoided Daniel's eyes while measuring out coffee and lamp oil. Daniel set a sack of coin on the counter. "Need feed as well." The man hesitated. "Feeds cash only now." Daniel's gaze lowered to the coin. "That is cash." The man cleared his throat. "I mean cash in advance for next order. Your account's been marked uncertain." Daniel went still. "By whom?" The keeper fussed with the ledger rather than answer. He did not need to. There was only one name in the valley that could make a merchant afraid of selling oats on a week's trust. Clara watched the man's fingers tremble over the page. When they stepped back into the street, Daniel carried the feed sack himself despite his ribs. "That was done on purpose," Clara said. "Yes. To shame you. To soften me." They crossed to the county office. A clerk behind the desk took Daniel's notice, glanced at the name, and suddenly became very interested in an ink bottle on the shelf behind him. "This was entered proper," he said. "Nothing I can do." "It was paid," Daniel answered. "Then bring proof." Daniel laid the March receipt on the counter. The clerk examined it only long enough to shrug. "Receipt number doesn't match current register." Clara leaned closer. "Then show us the register." The man blinked at her, surprised a woman had spoken at all. "Records aren't for public handling." Daniel's voice dropped lower, more dangerous for its quietness. "Then handle it where I can see." The clerk hesitated, then pulled the ledger from beneath the counter. Clara watched while Daniel searched the page. The line for Mercer grazing land was there, the balance due was there, but the earlier payment entry had vanished as if it had never been written. Daniel shut the book slowly. "Pages have been changed." The clerk stiffened. "Careful what you accuse, Mr. Mercer." Clara's eyes moved over the lower margin. A small notation. "Parcel number 17C." She looked back to Daniel's receipt. Same acreage, different parcel number. "Daniel," she said softly. He looked at her. "Your receipt says 17A." The clerk snatched the ledger back too quickly. A small thing, but it was enough. Daniel saw it. Clara saw that he saw it. Someone had shifted the parcel identifier after payment. A small change on paper, a large change in a man's life. Outside again, the wind dragged grit along the boardwalk. Daniel stood staring at the notice in his hand. "They're not making mistakes," Clara said. "They're moving pieces." Daniel folded the notice and slid it into his coat. "And they've got the county helping them." They went next to the livery to ask whether any man had seen the rider who watched the ranch in the night. The answer came with another silence, another careful glance away, another shrug that meant fear more than ignorance. By the time they headed home, the sun had dropped and the wagon was heavier with feed than with hope. Still, Clara sat quiet for most of the ride, not defeated, thinking. Daniel knew the look. He had worn it himself before grief taught him that some truths only broke a man faster. At the ranch, she carried the lamp into the house and spread the papers across the table. Daniel unsaddled the team, came in, and found her still standing there, studying every mark. "You aiming to outstare the ink?" he asked. "I'm aiming to understand it." He hung his hat on the peg. "It's simple enough. Langford wants this place." "No," Clara said. "That part is simple. The method is not." She motioned him closer. "These copied debts, these parcel numbers, they don't only touch your land." Daniel looked. 3 other ranches had the same clerk's initials near the bottom. 2 widows' homesteads. 1 small cattle spread along Dry Creek. Clara set the county notice beside them. "The style is the same hand, same way the numbers crowd to the right edge, same seal placement." Daniel frowned. "You can tell that. My father kept account books. I copied entries for him when I was 14. She took up another paper, one Daniel had nearly ignored for weeks. "This witness line here, on the transfer of your spring pasture." Daniel looked. "What about it?" "It says witnessed by Elias Boone." Daniel nodded. "Boone froze to death 2 winters ago." Clara met his eyes. For a moment neither of them spoke. The room seemed to pull tighter around the table. Daniel took the paper from her and checked the date again. Signed 6 months after Boone's burial. A dead man witnessing a living theft. Clara turned to the receipt from town. "And here." The parcel number changed, yes, but not at random. Your paid acreage from 17A becomes 17C. Dry Creek widow's land becomes 17A on her delinquent notice. He isn't inventing debts one at a time. He's shifting land between columns. Daniel bent over the pages. Now that she had said it, he saw the pattern. Pastures traded on paper. Creek access moved from one name to another. Taxes and balances following the wrong parcel lines until a rancher could no longer prove what belonged where. Not clumsy fraud system, a net cast over half the valley. He takes one man's payment, Clara said, and uses it to cover another line. Then he calls the first man delinquent. When that man fights, the books say otherwise. Daniel's hand flattened against the table. He can swallow every small ranch this way. Yes. The lamp hissed softly. Outside, a loose shutter tapped in the wind. Daniel looked at Clara with something new in his face, not only gratitude, respect sharpened by surprise. I had these papers for a month, he said. All I saw was crooked debt. You were looking for fists, she answered, not fingers. The words might have strung from anyone else. From her, they landed clean. Daniel sat down slowly. Clara gathered the documents into order, not nervous now, certain. There is more, she said. She pulled the county notice closer and pointed to the lower corner. A second stamp, faint beneath the county seal, Mercantile and Land Security Company. Daniel knew the name. Langford's Lending Arm. The respectable coat over the same rotten bones. If that company's stamp is under a county notice, Clara said, then private debt and public tax are being tied together. Once a man cannot pay one, the other crushes him. Daniel leaned back in the chair. The wood creaked under his weight. This isn't just about me. No, it's the whole valley. Yes. He rubbed a hand over his mouth. All his anger from the road, from the beating, from the note in the doorframe had been aimed at a single ranch, a single threat. Clara had just widened the horizon. The thing coming at them was larger than spite, larger than revenge. It was a machine built from ledgers, seals, frightened clerks, and a rich man's patience. From the yard came the sudden bawling of cattle. Daniel was on his feet at once. Clara snatched the lamp. They stepped onto the porch into cold blue dusk. Nothing moved beyond the fence but the herd crowding uneasy near the far trough. Then Daniel saw it, a strip of red cloth tied to the gatepost. He crossed the yard and untied it. Branded into the fabric with a hot iron was a single letter, L. No message, no need. Clara stood beside him as the wind snapped the cloth in Daniel's hand. He knows you went to town, she said. Daniel looked out across the darkening pasture. He knows more than that. The house behind them held warmth now, light, bread cooling on a cloth, the shape of two cups left on a table instead of one. The land before them held something else entirely, not just threat, design. And as Daniel Mercer stared into the coming night, he understood that the beating on the road had not been meant to end the matter. It had only been meant to warn him away from the truth Clara Whitlock had finally taught him how to see. Daniel stood at the gate until the last light drained off the pasture and the branded scrap of red cloth turned black in his hand. Clara touched his sleeve once. Come inside. He did not move at first. The wind pressed low over the grass. The cattle kept shifting in the dark as if something beyond the fence line still troubled them. At last, Daniel closed his fist around the cloth and turned toward the house. Inside, the warmth felt thinner than it had an hour before. The lamp burned steady on the table. The papers still lay in ordered stacks where Clara had placed them, proof of theft, proof of scheme, proof that a rich man had found a way to hide a noose inside ink. Daniel set the red cloth beside the documents. "He wants me angry," he said. Clara barred the door. "Are you?" Daniel looked at the brand. "Yes." "Then do not give him anger the way he wants it." He gave a dry, tired breath. "You say that like anger comes with rains." "It does for some men." He glanced at her. She crossed to the stove, lifted the kettle, and poured hot water into the basin by the hearth. Ordinary movements, quiet movements, the sort that held a house together while fear paced at the threshold. Daniel watched her a moment too long. "Why are you still here?" he asked. Clara stilled but did not turn. "You asked me to stay." "That was before." "Before what?" "Before you understood whose fight this is." Now she faced him. Firelight softened one side of her face and left the other in shadow. "I understood the first night," she said. "A man beaten in a ditch for asking honest questions, a house that keeps watch after dark, a valley that grows quiet at one name. I understood enough." Daniel's jaw tightened. "This gets worse now." "Yes. You could still leave by morning." "I could. But you won't." Clara shook her head once. "No." The answer landed with more force than any plea would have. Daniel looked away first. Near midnight, the dogs began barking, sharp, frenzied, not at a coyote, not at wind. Daniel was out of the chair before the second bark. He snatched the shotgun from the wall and hit the porch at a run, Clara close behind with the lantern. The barn was already burning. Flames licked up the dry outer boards and rolled orange through the loft like cloth snapping in a storm. Heat struck Daniel full in the face. One of the horses screamed inside. He did not think. He ran. "Daniel," Clara shouted. He was already at the door, hauling it open against the rush of smoke. Inside, fire crawled across the hay stored in the loft. Sparks rained down. The gelding slammed against its stall in blind terror. Daniel covered his mouth with his sleeve and lunged for the latch. Pain tore through his ribs so hard his knees almost buckled. He got the first horse loose. The animal burst past him into the yard. A beam cracked overhead. Clara appeared at the doorway with a wet blanket over her shoulders and another in her hands. "This one," she shouted, throwing him the second blanket. Daniel caught it, dragged it over his head and pushed deeper inside. The second horse fought him. Smoke, fear, fire spitting along the rafters. He cut the tether with his pocket knife and slapped the animal hard across the flank. It bolted through the door. Outside, Clara was already at the trough, filling buckets and throwing water against the side wall nearest the tack room. Not enough to save the barn, enough to slow the spread. Daniel stumbled out coughing. "Stay back," he rasped. Clara ignored him. Another crack split the night. Then the loft gave way. Fire dropped inward with a roar, and the barn lit the whole yard bright as day. Daniel turned toward the ridge beyond the corral and saw them. 3 riders, only shapes against the dark, sitting their horses still while the Mercer barn burned. Witnesses, authors. Clara saw them too. For one hard second, Daniel started toward the hitch rail, toward the nearest saddle horse, toward the old instinct that said a man answers fire with pursuit. Then Clara cried out. He turned. A board from the barn roof had fallen across the fence line where she stood, not on her. Close enough, sparks had caught her skirt hem, small flames ran up the fabric. Daniel crossed the yard in 3 strides and dropped to his knees in the dirt, beating out the fire with his bare hands. When it was gone, he looked up. The riders were already turning away. He could have gone after them. Could have mounted and chased hate into the dark. Instead, his hands stayed on Clara's shoulders, making certain the flames were dead and her breath still steady. She stared at him, shaken but unbroken. "You should have gone after them," she whispered. Daniel looked toward the ridge once more. "No." The word came rough and low. The barn collapsed behind them in a shower of sparks. By dawn there was little left but black beams, wet ash, and the smell of burned grain drifting over the yard. Daniel moved through the wreckage in silence. He found twisted horseshoes, a bent lantern hook, the iron frame of the saddle rack. Every step seemed to land on some small piece of what a man needed to keep a ranch running. Clara carried what could still be saved to the porch: a curry comb, half a crate of nails, one saddle spared because Daniel had left it in the house after the beating. The world after fire always looked stripped down to truth. This one did too. At mid-morning, a wagon came up the road from town, not a neighbor offering help. Two men in clean coats, one deputy, one county assessor. They climbed down slow, as if smoke and ruin were merely part of their day's work. The assessor unrolled a paper. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "under the delinquent conditions attached to your grazing acreage, this loss may affect your ability to maintain operations." Daniel stood blackened with soot, one hand hanging loose at his side. "Say what you came to say." The man cleared his throat. "If solvency cannot be demonstrated, a temporary transfer of authority may be recommended pending settlement." Clara went still on the porch. Daniel's face changed in a way the assessor was too foolish to notice, and the deputy noticed too late. They had not come because of the fire. They had come because the fire was part of the plan. Clara stepped down from the porch with the charred red cloth in one hand and the false notice in the other. "Interesting timing," she said. The assessor barely looked at her. "This is county business. It is arson tied to fraud." He gave her the thin smile men used when they mistook contempt for power. Daniel took one step forward. The smile vanished. "You came to count my loss before the ashes cooled," Daniel said. "That tells me whose table you ate at before sunrise." The deputy shifted uneasily. The assessor rolled up the paper again. "Mind yourself, Mercer." Daniel's voice dropped lower. "I have been minding myself too long." No one spoke after that. The wagon left with dust rolling behind it, and for the first time since the ditch road, Daniel did not feel merely hunted. He felt awake. Clara stood beside the ruined barn, the morning wind moving ash around their boots. "They wanted you broken," she said. Daniel looked at the black skeleton of the barn. "They wanted me cornered. And now—" He turned to her. Smoke had smudged one cheek. A burn mark darkened the cuff of her dress. She looked tired. Frightened too, though she held it down with that same iron steadiness she had carried since the road. He saw all at once what the night had truly decided. Not the loss of a barn, not the weight of debt, not even the size of Langford's reach. He saw Clara kneeling in the ditch with torn sleeves and stubborn eyes, saw her at his stove, at his table over his papers, saw flames running up her skirt while three men watched from the ridge. The old wound in him shifted then, not healed. Never that easy. But shifted. For 5 years he had lived as if love and duty were traps laid by Providence to prove a man weak. He had kept to land because land did not call out in floodwater, did not wait at a window, did not stand in the yard while fire came, and yet here she was. A woman with no claim on him except mercy freely given. A woman now standing in the center of his danger because she had chosen not to run. "What are you thinking?" Clara asked. Daniel bent, picked up a scorched branding iron from the ashes and tossed it aside. I'm thinking Langford made a mistake. She waited. He thought burning wood would send me backward. Instead, Daniel crossed to the porch, went inside, and returned with the cloth bundle of papers. He set them on the charred hitching rail and untied the string. All this time, he said, I've been trying to survive what he started. He looked up at the empty ridge where the riders had watched. I'm done surviving. Clara's breath caught slightly. Daniel lifted the forged records, the altered receipt, the notice with its false seal. He wants this valley kept afraid and separate, one ranch at a time, one widow at a time, one debt at a time. The wind stirred the papers in his hand. Then we stopped letting it be one at a time. We, Clara asked softly. Daniel met her gaze. Yes, we. No flourish in it, no romance spoken aloud, something steadier than that, a choice. The choice landed between them like a stake driven into open ground. Clara stepped closer. What will you do? Daniel looked toward town. First, I ride to every ranch named in these papers. You're still hurt. I know. You could be killed. Yes. She searched his face for doubt and found none. This was not the Daniel Mercer who had watched doors and windows to hold grief outside. This was a quieter, harder thing, a man who had remembered too late once and would not do so again. I'll come with you, she said. He started to refuse from habit alone. She saw it before he spoke. Do not waste time trying to leave me behind, she said. I read the numbers, I know the pattern, and Langford's men have already made me part of this. Daniel let the silence stretch, then he nodded once, all right. By afternoon, they had salvaged enough tack for 2 horses and packed the papers into Clara's valise beneath spare shirts and bandages. The house behind them smelled of smoke and bread and wet ash. The yard looked wounded, but not empty, not beaten. Before mounting, Daniel paused at the porch. His eyes went to the second cup still resting on the kitchen table through the open door. A small thing, a house no longer built for one. He turned back to Clara. She stood ready beside the gelding, wind lifting loose strands of her hair. Not innocent now in the way the world used that word. Still good. Still unbroken. Still the reason something fierce had risen in him before the fire had even finished falling. We ride first to Dry Creek, he said. She nodded. And after that. Daniel settled himself into the saddle despite the ache in his ribs. After that, he said, we bring Langford's house down in daylight. Then they turned their horses toward the road, carrying smoke on their coats and truth in Clara's bag. And for the first time since the ditch, Daniel Mercer rode not as a wounded man trying to keep his losses small, but as a protector with someone left to protect. By the time Daniel Mercer and Clara Whitlock rode back into town, the sun was standing high and hard over the valley. Dust hung pale in the street. Wagon wheels had cut deep tracks through it. Men stood beneath the awnings of the mercantile and feed store, talking low until they saw who was coming. Then the talking thinned. Daniel rode with his hat low and his coat buttoned despite the heat. Clara rode beside him with her valise strapped tight behind the saddle. Inside it lay the forged notices, the altered receipts, the copied ledgers, and 3 sworn statements gathered from ranchers along Dry Creek and Widow Harlan's spread north of the bend. Enough to trouble honest men, enough to ruin crooked ones if daylight ever reached the right page. They had spent 2 days crossing the valley, 2 days of doors opening slow, 2 days of fear sitting behind every handshake. Yet fear had shifted each time. Clara laid the papers on a table, and Daniel said, in his spare, quiet way, "You aren't the only one." Now they came to collect the cost. "The meeting starts at noon," Clara said. Daniel nodded. The county hall stood near the center of town, whitewashed once and then left to weather. Outside it, horses were tied thick along the rail, ranchers, shopkeepers, clerks, a preacher, 2 widows dressed in dark wool despite the heat. Word had spread that Langford's company meant to announce several new land transfers before the week was out. Men came for different reasons: curiosity, worry, hunger to see who would be swallowed next. Daniel swung down carefully. His ribs still reminded him of the road, the fire, the long rides between scattered ranches. Clara took her valise and stepped beside him. Across the street, under the shade of the hotel porch, Rourke Langford watched them arrive. He was a broad man in a dark coat cut too fine for the dust of the territory. His beard was neat. His boots were polished. Nothing about him looked hurried. A man who had spent years teaching the valley that calm itself could be a weapon. His eyes settled first on Daniel, then on Clara. He smiled slightly, as if greeting guests he had expected all along. Daniel met the look and kept walking. Inside the hall, the air held the smell of pine boards, ink, and summer sweat. Benches filled quickly. The county assessor sat near the front with his papers stacked in careful order. The deputy from Mercer's burned ranch stood by the wall, hands clasped behind his back and eyes fixed nowhere. The county judge took his chair on the raised platform and tapped a small wooden block once for quiet. Langford stepped forward when his name was called. He moved with the ease of a man accustomed to rooms bending toward him. He spoke plainly, smoothly, about efficiency, about debt, about neglected parcels that required responsible ownership. His company, he said, merely helped the valley through difficult times. No one accused him aloud, not yet. He had that gift, making theft sound like stewardship. Daniel felt the room folding the way it always had, men looking down, women tightening their hands in their laps. Fear doing Langford's work before he had to lift a finger. Then Clara rose, not abruptly, not dramatic. She simply stood and placed her valise on the bench before her. A stir moved through the room. The judge frowned. "This hearing is not." "It is," Clara said, and her voice, though soft, carried cleanly. "If the county means to move land today, the county can first hear how that land was taken." Langford turned toward her at last. There was nothing in his face for the room to seize upon. No anger, no surprise. Just the same patient contempt he had likely worn before smaller people for 20 years. "And you are," he asked, "a woman you counted too small to notice the numbers." A few heads turned then, truly turned. Daniel remained seated for one heartbeat more, then he stood beside her. The judge shifted uneasily. "Mr. Mercer, this is highly irregular." Daniel placed the first altered receipt on the front table. "So is a dead man witnessing a land transfer." Silence dropped hard across the room. Langford did not move. Clara opened the valise and withdrew the papers one by one, laying them out where all could see. The forged debt notices, the changed parcel entries, the county order stamped underneath with the mark of Langford's lending company. Daniel added the sworn statements from the ranchers who had compared receipts and discovered the same pattern repeated across their property lines. The judge looked from paper to paper, the color in his face beginning to shift. Langford's voice remained calm. Loose accusations and copied scraps, nothing more. Widow Harlan stood from the second bench. "My husband paid that tax before he took fever," she said. "Your clerk called us delinquent 6 months later." Another rancher rose near the back, and mine changed from creek access to dry ground on the books after I signed no such thing. Then another, then one of the widows Clara and Daniel had visited. Fear did not disappear from the room, it changed shape, it became motion. The deputy by the wall glanced at the assessor. The assessor wiped his brow. Daniel took up the transfer sheet bearing Elias Boone's name and held it so the judge could see the date. "Boone was buried 2 winters ago," he said. "Either you've got ghosts signing paper in this county, or someone trusted too much in the silence of decent people." Langford's jaw hardened for the first time. "Mind yourself," he said quietly. Daniel stepped closer to the table. "No." The word was low, final. It carried farther than shouting would have. Clara drew one more item from the valise, the strip of red cloth branded with Langford's mark. She set it beside the county notice. This was left at Mr. Mercer's gate before his barn was burned. The room murmured then, openly now. Langford turned toward the deputy. "Are we to indulge every tale told by frightened ranchers and stray women?" Daniel moved before anyone else could. He caught Langford's wrist as the man reached for the papers. Not violently, not wild, just firm enough to stop the hand. The entire room froze around that contact. Daniel's eyes never left Langford's. "You burn barns at night," Daniel said. "You hide behind seals by day, but you do it in front of the same people every time. That was your mistake." Langford tried to pull free. Daniel did not let him. The judge rose half out of his chair. "Mr. Mercer." Clara spoke before panic could scatter the moment. "Ask your assessor, whose hand altered parcels 17A to 17C. Ask why the company stamp sits beneath a county seal. Ask why the books changed after payments were made. Ask him here, in front of everyone." Every face in the room swung toward the assessor. The man faltered. Sweat rolled visibly down his temple. Langford's voice sharpened. "Say nothing." Too late, the assessor broke in the way weak men always do, quickly, and with relief that the fear might finally belong to someone else. "He told me to move the entries," he said, "only to hold them until settlement. He said it was temporary." The hall erupted. The judge banged for order. No one listened. The deputy stepped away from the wall at last, and when he did not move toward Daniel. He moved toward Langford. The land baron's calm cracked then, only slightly, but enough. "You fools," he snapped. "Every acre in this valley would have collapsed without my money." Widow Harlan's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "We might have preferred the collapse to your kindness." A hard, rough laugh rose somewhere in the back benches, then another. The judge pounded again and found his voice. "Rourke Langford, you will surrender those records and remain in county custody until a full examination is made." Langford looked around the room and saw, perhaps for the first time in many years, that his name no longer held it together. He saw ranchers standing instead of shrinking, widows with their chins raised, a deputy no longer willing to look away, and Daniel Mercer, wounded and soot-marked and quiet as stone, still standing between him and the papers that would strip him bare. Langford was led out in daylight. That mattered. The whole town saw it. By evening, the air had changed. Not the heat, not the dust, something deeper, as if the valley itself had let out a breath held too long. 3 days later, Daniel and Clara rode home. The ranch met them in silence. Burned barn timbers still black against the yard, fence rails needing work, ash worked into the ground by wind and time, yet the place no longer felt beaten. Before sunset, a wagon rolled up from Dry Creek with fresh-cut lumber in back. The rancher driving it only said, "For the frame." An hour later, Widow Harlan's oldest boy brought 2 sacks of seed grain. The next morning came nails, then shingles, then a team offered for plowing until Daniel's stock recovered. No speeches, no grand promises, just help. By the end of the week, new posts stood where the fire had scorched the old ones. Hammer blows rang across the yard. The porch held extra cups. Supper stretched to feed whoever was still working when the light ran low. Clara moved through it all with her sleeves rolled and her hair tied back, carrying water, measuring boards, setting bread to rise before dawn. She laughed once at something Widow Harlan said over a bent nail, and Daniel looked up from the fence line as if hearing summer after a long winter. That evening, when the last wagon had gone and only the 2 of them remained, the prairie lay gold beneath a slow sunset. Daniel sat on the porch step with a plane in one hand and a curl of cedar at his boot. Clara came out carrying 2 cups. She handed him one and sat beside him. For a while they said nothing. The new barn frame stood dark against the warm sky, stronger already than the ruin that had fallen. "The house sounds different now," Clara said softly. Daniel looked toward the open door behind them. Inside were plates drying by the sink, a shawl over the chair back, bread cooling beneath a cloth. "Yes," he said. Clara lowered her eyes to the cup in her hands. "I can still leave when the work is done." Daniel set down the plane. The old answer would have been caution, distance, another season of keeping watch alone. Instead, he reached for her hand. The wedding band scar on his finger caught the last of the light. "You could," he said, "but I'd rather you stayed." Clara looked at him then, and all the road weariness, all the rejection, all the danger they had crossed seemed to soften into something quieter and stronger. "Why?" she asked. Daniel's hand tightened gently around hers. "Because you dragged me out of the dirt," he said, "and somewhere between the fire and the fight, you did something harder." She waited. He gave the smallest shake of his head, a man still learning how to speak plain about tender things. "You made this place feel like a home again." The prairie wind moved lightly through the new-cut boards. A horse stamped in the yard. Far off, cattle shifted under the coming dusk. Clara leaned against his shoulder. Daniel did not flinch from it. He let the warmth settle, let the silence hold. And as the first evening star came up over the valley, Daniel Mercer understood that healing had not arrived the way he once imagined it might. Not clean, not sudden, not free of scars. It had come by way of a rejected bride, a burned barn, a table full of forged papers, and the hard choice to stand in daylight instead of hiding in memory. Now the valley was safer, the house was fuller, and the heart he had believed lost to floodwater and regret had found, at last, something worth opening for again. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help this old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matter. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.